When Strong died, power drifted away from New York and toward the board in Washington and the regional reserve banks, many led by men with far less sophistication and a far more rigid attachment to orthodoxy. What had been reasonably centralized decision-making became fractured and hesitant. Economist Charles Kindleberger went even further, arguing that had Strong lived past 1928, the Depression might have been avoided altogether, or at least been far milder, a claim that underscores just how much this catastrophe hinged on institutional weakness at a decisive hour. Now shift to the late 1920s, the era most people picture as an unbroken party. There really was genuine prosperity in America then. Factories humming, new consumer goods reshaping daily life, stock prices climbing. But underneath that shine sat a flaw almost nobody in power wanted to confront. The prosperity wasn't reaching most people. By 1929, the wealthiest 1% of families collected close to 24% of all pre-tax income. The richest 0.1% earned roughly as much as the entire bottom 42% combined, and roughly 80% of households had no savings at all, even as corporate profits and share prices soared. This wasn't merely unfair, it was a structural time bomb. An industrial economy depends on mass consumption, and when most people can barely cover essentials, the system becomes dangerously top-heavy. The wealthy can only buy so many refrigerators. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith listed this skewed income distribution as one of the 5 core weaknesses dragging the American economy toward collapse, and put it first on the list, ahead of the stock market, ahead of the banks. Once people can no longer afford what the economy produces, you get overproduction paired with underconsumption, inventories build up, factories scale back, workers lose hours, then jobs, and the cycle feeds itself. The wealthy weren't funneling their surplus into consumer spending. They were pouring it into speculation, stocks, real estate, the very bubbles that would eventually burst. Meanwhile, middle-class families, trying to keep pace with the prosperity around them, borrowed to spend. Consumer credit expanded rapidly, and household debt kept climbing even as wage growth stalled. If that pattern sounds uncomfortably familiar to anyone who lived through 2008, it should. So, when the stock market began to wobble in the fall of 1929, it wasn't falling into a healthy economy. It was falling into one already cooling, already weakened by inequality, already overloaded with debt, and already being squeezed dry by a monetary system draining liquidity from the entire globe. The crash was the spark, but the building was already soaked in fuel. And here's the crucial part about the crash itself. It didn't have to end the world. Markets had crashed before, a sharp panic in 1907 that J.P. Morgan personally helped calm. A serious recession in 1920 and 1921 the economy shook off fairly quickly. What made 1929 different wasn't the crash, it was the disastrous response that followed it. When the banking system started buckling in the fall of 1930, the Federal Reserve, leaderless and divided since Strong's death, essentially froze. It didn't flood the system with cash, nor act as the lender of last resort it had been created in 1913 to be. Instead, it watched bank after bank collapse, draining the money supply at a terrifying speed. Between 1929 and 1933, America's money supply shrank by roughly a third. A fifth of all commercial banks shut their doors for good, and real income fell by 36%. In 1931, with the economy already in free fall, the Fed hiked its discount rate from 1.5% to 3.5%, tightening policy in the middle of a deflationary collapse, all to defend the gold standard. In other words, the Fed chose to protect an abstraction, the gold value of the dollar, over the well-being of millions of Americans. Ben Bernanke, who would later chair the Fed during the 2008 crisis, gave a now legendary speech honoring Milton Friedman in 2002, addressing him directly about the Depression with something close to an institutional confession, admitting the Fed had gotten it badly wrong and pledging it wouldn't happen again. But the Fed's failures, staggering as they were, still don't fully explain how a recession turned into a decade-long global catastrophe. For that, you need another disastrous decision, this one made not by central bankers, but by Congress. In June 1930, President Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law, raising duties on more than 20,000 imported goods to some of the highest levels in American history. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition begging Hoover not to sign it. He signed it anyway. Canada immediately slapped retaliatory tariffs on 16 categories of American goods, and Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and dozens more nations followed with tariff walls of their own. Within 2 years, more than 24 countries had erected retaliatory barriers. Global trade collapsed by roughly 66% between 1929 and 1934, and American exports to Europe plunged from about $2.3 billion in 1929 to just $784 million by 1932. Remember that reparations loop? Smoot-Hawley blew it apart. If Germany couldn't sell goods into the American market, it couldn't earn dollars to service its debts, And American lending to Germany had already been drying up since 1928 when the Fed raised rates. Once lending stopped completely, the reparation structure collapsed. In 1931, Austria's largest bank, the Kreditanstalt, failed. Panic spread into Germany, and Britain abandoned the gold standard that September. One domino toppled the next. Now let's pull every one of these threads together, because the real horror of the Great Depression isn't any single cause. It's how these failures compounded one another into a spiral no single fix could have stopped. The unresolved legacy of the First World War left behind a global debt structure that was inherently unstable and politically impossible to reform. The gold standard was rigidly reimposed on a world that could no longer support it, concentrating monetary gold in American and French vaults, while the rest of the world starved for liquidity. The death of Benjamin Strong robbed the Federal Reserve of its most capable leader at the exact moment competent leadership was most needed, and the Fed that followed pursued disastrously tight policy, letting the money supply collapse and refusing to act as lender of last resort. Extreme income inequality hollowed out consumer demand. Reckless speculation inflated bubbles that were always going to burst, and Smoot-Hawley demolished international trade and cooperation at precisely the moment the world needed it most. Any one of these alone might have produced an ordinary recession. Together, they produced a catastrophe that devastated hundreds of millions of lives. Industrial production in the United States fell by nearly 47%, national output shrank by 30%, unemployment topped 20% nationally and hit 50% or higher in some cities, and families that had been comfortably middle class a year earlier found themselves standing in breadlines. And the tragedy is that almost none of it was inevitable. The gold standard didn't need to be reimposed so rigidly. France didn't need to hoard gold the way it did. The Fed didn't need to let the banking system implode. And Congress didn't need to pass Smoot-Hawley. These were decisions made by real people inside real institutions, frequently with good intentions. And together, they produced the worst economic disaster of the modern era. What most retellings get wrong is compressing all this complexity into a single sentence. The market crashed, and then the Depression happened. That framing makes it sound like a natural disaster that simply descended on the world unannounced. It wasn't. It was manufactured layer by layer by central bankers worshiping gold, by politicians choosing isolation over cooperation, and by institutions that failed to act when action could still have changed everything. But lessons fade. The generation that lived through breadlines and total ruin is gone now, and the safeguards they built are being questioned, weakened, or dismantled piece by piece. There's one more part of this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The human cost hiding behind the statistics. Unemployment reaching 25% meant roughly 13 million Americans with no work and no real prospects. The father pretending each morning to go to a job that no longer existed. The children sitting through school hungry. The quiet erosion of dignity that comes from years of poverty inside the wealthiest nation on earth. In the rural South and the Great Plains, the Depression collided with an environmental catastrophe of its own making. The Dust Bowl, a decade-long ecological disaster caused by aggressive farming practices, and a punishing drought, turned millions of acres of fertile land into desert. Families, whose land had been destroyed, loaded what little they had into worn-out trucks and headed west toward California, where they were met with hostility rather than sympathy. Suicide rates climbed sharply in the early 1930s. Malnutrition spread widely among children, and in parts of Appalachia and the industrial Midwest, people were dying not from exotic disease, but from the plain, grinding consequences of poverty and untreated illness.